The story begins amidst a blood-soaked battlefield. Countless warriors, humans and other races alike, stood united, their collective goal singular and unshaken: to destroy the demon, a man once known as Nox von Rienhaver. Their desperate battle was not merely one of survival, but a last, fevered attempt to restore balance to a world teetering on the brink of ruin. From afar, a massive offensive was launched. The Alliance had assembled an overwhelming force. Men, monsters, even dragons, all converging toward a single swordsman, a white-haired warrior standing amidst the carnage, gripping his black blade. A knight, positioned in the rear, bellowed to his comrades to cut down the monster, his voice echoing across the battlefield. Fueled by raw determination, the warriors roared in unison, charging forward with all their might. And yet, Leon remained eerily composed. His gaze was locked onto Nox von Rienhaver, a flicker of nostalgia surfacing in his cold, calculating eyes. Those very words, once spoken by his closest friend, a comrade who had fought beside him through countless battles, echoed in his mind. Leon could still recall that moment vividly, though he had never fully understood its depth. But one thing was certain. When those words had been spoken, he had seen tears of anguish streaming down the fading eyes of his friend. On that day, the power of Nox von Rienhaver was overwhelming. Even faced with a relentless wave of monsters and warriors, he did not falter. His expression remained unchanged, cold, resolute, and utterly unshaken. Every swing of his blade was a death sentence. A single, swift slash cleaved through dozens of enemies at once. It didn't matter whether they were human or beast. None who dared challenge him survived. He was a calamity incarnate. In mere moments, the battlefield had become a graveyard. Corpses lay scattered across the blood-soaked land, a grim testament to the absolute devastation wrought by the swordsman standing amidst the carnage. Nox tightened his grip on his sword, his movements slow but deliberate, stepping forward with a single destination in mind: Leon von Marba, who stood resolutely at the opposite end of the field. Leon maintained his composure. Finally, he spoke calmly, though his voice carried emotions he struggled to contain. He asked why his friend had turned his back on him. Even as the words left his mouth, Leon himself could not fully comprehend how things had come to this. He wondered what had driven Nox to make a pact with demons, whether he had betrayed them humanity, or if everything they had fought for meant nothing. Nox scoffed. He spoke of Leon's tone, the mannerisms. It all reminded him of someone else, a distant memory, a shadow of the past, but questioned whether it even mattered at this point. The cryptic response only deepened Leon's curiosity. He refused to back down, stating that while it might not mean anything to Nox now, it meant everything to him. He demanded to know why Nox had abandoned them and betrayed everything they had fought for. For the first time, the smirk faded from Nox's lips. His features hardened, and his gaze turned cold as steel. He declared that if Leon truly wanted answers and to end the suffering, he would need to kill him. That, he said, was Leon's only option. The weight of Nox's words pressed down like an executioner's blade, and within Nox's eyes, a killing intent began to rise. Leon inhaled deeply, his expression unreadable, and stated that if this was what Nox wanted, then he would do it. As the final word left his lips, the grimoire in his hands flipped open on its own. An ominous purple aura erupted from his body, spreading outward like a flood, coiling around the fallen knights littering the battlefield. The dead began to rise, their empty, soulless eyes flickering to life with an eerie glow. Their movements were slow at first, then grew unnaturally fluid. And without Leon uttering a command, the undead army surged forward, drawn by the scent of fresh blood lingering on Nox. Mere seconds. That was all it took. Nox's blade flashed before anyone could even register the movement. A storm of slashes carved through the battlefield, the air howling with the shrieking sound of steel. The chilling noise sent a shiver down the spine of anyone who heard it. The bodies of the undead in front of him were covered in countless slashes. However, moments later, the wounds began to heal at a speed visible to the naked eye. Within just 2 seconds, they had completely disappeared, leaving no scars behind. This was because Leon was supplying them with mana from behind. With bodies that were immortal and knew no fear of death, the undead charged forward once more, attacking without hesitation or doubt. The leading undead swung its sword, aiming straight for Nox. A metallic clang echoed through the air. From Nox's perspective, he remained calm, effortlessly parrying each of the attacks from the creatures before him. Then, in a single swift movement, he stepped forward, swung his sword at lightning speed, and instantly cleaved the lead undead in half, severing it so completely that there was no chance of recovery. Before long, under Nox's overwhelming strength, the rest of the monsters met their end. The black sword in his hand became enveloped in a dark purple aura, and his eyes gleamed with excitement as he let out a loud laugh. He noticed Leon had gotten much stronger. With those words, Nox braced himself, pushing off with his legs and lunging forward with incredible speed. Meanwhile, the book in Leon's hand automatically flipped through a few more pages. Whatever spell he had just cast, a massive six-pointed magic circle suddenly appeared behind him. A dark, swirling portal materialized, and from within, two massive crimson hands wielding great swords reached out. Then, a towering undead warrior, clad in heavy armor, emerged from the portal, standing on the opposite side of Nox. Instead of feeling fear, Nox was utterly exhilarated. Behind him, ghostly images of several eerie eyes flickered into existence, radiating a sinister aura that sent chills down anyone's spine. Without exchanging another word, both sides launched straight into battle. A massive explosion erupted upon impact, sending clouds of dust billowing across the battlefield. The sheer force of the clash caused Leon to stumble, momentarily losing his footing. Before he could regain his balance, Nox's figure appeared right in front of him, with a sword charged with mana. Nox swung directly at Leon with a strike so fast that it tore through the air like a razor-sharp gale. However, Leon was no pushover. At that moment, he commanded the massive undead warrior behind him to move, raising its enormous sword to block Nox's incoming strike. For a brief moment, both of them stood in a temporary standstill. Leon stared directly into Nox's eyes. His voice was cold and unwavering as he spoke. He would kill Nox if necessary to get an explanation from a revived corpse. The answer about why Nox had turned his back on them. These wounds Nox had left behind would never fade from his memory. Leon questioned why. Nox, he once knew so well, had chosen to disappear from this world and embrace solitude instead. The battle was nearing its end. As Nox himself had said, nothing would be resolved until one of them fell on this battlefield. Leon silently acknowledged this in his heart, accepting the inevitability of it. Everything began with a scene where a razor-sharp guillotine, still tainted with fresh blood, stood ready for its next execution. Beneath the looming blade, a man awaited his punishment. Just 10 feet away, the cold, menacing steel hung overhead, casting a dark shadow over the man's jet-black hair. The deepest fear imaginable weighed heavily on his soul, like a terrifying nightmare brought to life. Leon stood there, his gaze fixed on the man, his eyes lifeless and devoid of emotion. In his hand, he still gripped a short sword, the weight of the situation pressing on him. Meanwhile, the man beneath the guillotine bore the same hollow gaze, his face eerily resembling Leon's. A woman spoke, her face contorted with grief. She questioned how things had come to this, wondering what their lord had done to deserve such humiliation. Beside her, a man immediately reached out, motioning for her to keep quiet. He warned her to watch her words, for if she didn't, she would be the next one to meet the guillotine. His gaze then shifted toward the platform where a nobleman, dressed in fine garments, observed the scene with twisted delight. As the man continued, reminding her of the harsh reality, they had seen enough to understand the merciless nature of those rulers. The woman hesitated before responding, struggling to find the right words. But the man shook his head, his tone resigned. The only thing they could do was stay silent and far away from those in power. In this era of war, silence was the only way to survive. The flames of death continued to rage across the continent, leaving only destruction in their wake. As the ashes of slaughter engulfed the eastern lands, the noble house of Marba had become another victim of this hellish conflict. In the wake of war, The strong did as they pleased while the weak were left with nothing but theft and desperation. The weak had no choice but to gamble with their lives daily, constantly dancing with death, unable to escape the gates of hell. Overseeing this, the head of the rival Sylvester family, Count Alan de Sylvester, stood watching the man bound beneath the guillotine. A smirk played on his lips as he spoke with amusement, eager for the event to begin. Around him, the crowd murmured louder, but amidst the noise, Leon remained completely still, like a statue. Seeing this, Alan frowned slightly, reminding him that he had given an order. Hearing those words, Leon finally moved. He extended his hands, gripping the hilt of his sword tightly, and stepped toward the rope holding the execution blade in place. However, for a moment, he hesitated, his body frozen, unable to act. Above, Alan, overwhelmed with anticipation, could no longer contain himself. His voice sharp and impatient, he urged Leon to cut the rope. Leon's body moved like a lifeless puppet, devoid of will. His arms slowly lifted, and with the crowd watching in stunned silence, the sword in his hands came down, slicing through the rope. The guillotine was released, its blade descending swiftly and executing the unknown man in an instant. The sound of death was as sickening as a cleaver striking meat. Crimson droplets painted a gruesome portrait across the pale face of the young boy, filling the air with the metallic scent of blood and iron. No one could escape the brutal reality before them. It was as if fate had orchestrated the cruelest of ironies. This was the unbearable burden the boy was forced to carry, to sever all ties between his father and the mortal realm. Leon von Marbach, son of Rune von Marbach, stood as the executioner of royal blood, the one who had executed his own father. The head of a noble house was not just a member of the aristocracy, but the very pillar upon which the kingdom rested. Yet, as a playwright once wrote, great power came with great responsibility, a burden only those capable of bearing it could endure. With Rune's death, Leon rose as the new head of House Marbach. Later, in House Marbach's council chamber, Leon sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable as he silently observed the heated arguments unfolding before him. A man with slicked-back brown hair slammed his fist onto the table, his voice echoing through the chamber. He expressed concern that House Sylvester was expanding its influence at an alarming rate, warning that they might soon invade Marbach territory outright. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room as one by one the council members turned to Leon, their voices thick with urgency. They implored him to fortify the defenses immediately, begging for a decision. Sat at one of the seats, an older man with a thick beard nodded solemnly, acknowledging the moment. The time had come, he said, for Leon to bestow his wise judgment upon them. Faced with mounting pressure, Leon responded in a calm, detached tone, urging patience. He needed more time to contemplate. Rising from his seat, he signaled his intent to leave the council chamber. His abrupt movement left the room in stunned silence, but protests soon erupted. They could not understand his hesitation, the urgency of the matter, and the potential disaster looming over House Marbach. Ignoring the protests, Leon exited swiftly, his mind focused elsewhere. As he walked down the silent corridor, deep in thought, he reflected on his position. With the passing of his father, Rune von Marbach, the head of House Marbach, Leon had been forced to take his place at the young age of 14. The Marbach family had once been a formidable lineage of necromancers, wielding a power that struck fear into all who knew their name. However, that legacy had long since faded, lost to the relentless tide of history. Leon cast his gaze toward two portraits hanging in the hallway. One depicted a man, the other a woman. He halted, slowly approaching the portraits and studying them in silence. In a quiet moment, he asked what they would wish for him to do in their stead. He knew the question would go unanswered. His parents were gone, and the dead could not speak. Still, he longed for guidance on how to restore the family's lost glory. Lost in thought, Leon soon found himself standing before a grand door. Above it hung yet another portrait, this one of Wellen von Marbach, the progenitor of his bloodline. A sliver of light obscured the features of the painting, adding an air of mystery. Wellen von Marbach had been a legend in his time, the only true necromancer of the age. Legends told of how he first rose to power on the battlefield, carving his name into the annals of history. Yet, since the golden era of their founder, House Marba had struggled to produce another true necromancer. Over time, the family had steadily declined, and in the end, Leon had been forced to take his father's life with his own hands. The weight of that realization settled heavily over him. He exhaled deeply, then reached for the door handle, pushing it open. Inside his father's study, 2 books lay on the desk, one of which stood out, its cover pitch black, emblazoned with the symbol of an eye. Leon's gaze lingered on it, his mind drifting to thoughts of his family's history. Wellen von Marba had been a near-mythical figure, capable of decimating enemies with a mere wave of his hand, summoning endless legions of the undead in an unceasing tide of destruction. It was said that he forged a pact with the demon King Marba to unlock one of the continent's greatest mysteries, the forbidden tome that granted him the power to rule as an emperor of the dead. This, Leon realized, was the Necromancer Codex, a priceless relic passed down from their founder, the very artifact that had once elevated House Marba to its peak. With that in mind, Leon carefully flipped through the pages, scanning them intently. Then, suddenly, a voice echoed in his mind. The unexpected presence startled him. His body stiffened, and his gaze darted around the room. Who had spoken? He muttered under his breath, wondering how a voice had entered his mind, especially in a chamber shielded against magic. After a brief pause, Leon regained his composure, speaking aloud, his voice calm and measured. He asked the identity of the one addressing him. The voice responded, reassuring him that it posed no threat. It spoke of fear not, though Leon felt uneasy. Sweat beaded on his face as he asked why he should believe it. In response, an intricate magic circle appeared behind him, pulsing with ancient power. Then, in the blink of an eye, Leon found himself face to face with a colossal lion. The lion, towering and majestic, had curved goat-like horns upon its head, and its rich auburn mane flowed like fire. For any ordinary person, such a sight would be terrifying enough to make them tremble in fear. But Leon's expression remained completely impassive, showing no trace of fear. He simply asked where he was. The massive lion appeared somewhat surprised, lifting one of its enormous paws and pointing at itself in confusion before speaking again. It wondered aloud if Leon's predecessor had never mentioned its existence. Leon's eyes narrowed slightly, his tone growing colder as he asked if the lion was referring to his father, Rune von Marba. The lion gave a slight nod in response, confirming the connection. It spoke with a mix of disdain and regret, explaining that it had sensed the magical bond between it and Leon's father had been severed. A flicker of rage crossed the lion's face, its powerful jaws clenching with an audible creak. It spoke of how it had feared Rune's merciful nature, which had made him unfit to lead a dark family. The lion admitted it should have foreseen the tragic end Rune would meet, but it demanded to know who struck the final blow. Leon, making no attempt to hide the truth, answered with indifference. He calmly declared that it was he, Leon von Marba, his own son, who had killed his father. The lion froze, stunned by the admission. An overwhelming surge of energy erupted from its massive form, shaking the air as its voice thundered with fury. It demanded confirmation once more, roaring in rage, its jaws opening wide as if ready to devour Leon. Yet, despite this terrifying display, Leon remained utterly unfazed. His cold, unwavering gaze met the lion's burning eyes, and he firmly repeated his statement. It was he who killed his own father. The lion's fury intensified, and its body erupted with a monstrous, killing intent directed straight at Leon. In that moment, memories of Rune's death flooded Leon's mind. His father's final moments, the sensation of warm blood splattering onto his skin. That feeling had never left him. But it wasn't just Leon who relived these memories. The enormous lion saw them as well. As it absorbed the emotions Leon had felt during the act, the violent rage that had surged through its being began to fade. The lion fixed its gaze upon Leon. It spoke, its tone heavy with disappointment, observing that although Leon had carried out the act, he was not truly the one who had killed his father. Leon slightly lowered his head, his voice steady as he replied that this was not true and that the lion knew it. The lion's expression shifted slightly, intrigued by Leon's response. It let out a small sigh before lying down on the ground, its piercing eyes never leaving Leon as it observed him closely. Setting aside its disappointment, the lion expressed its interest in the abyssal aura it sensed within Leon. Beneath the emotionless facade, the lion could feel the immense reservoir of magic the boy carried. It was perplexed by how such a young child could contain so much power. As it pondered, its perception revealed something even more unsettling. Beneath Leon's feet, countless corpses were piled high like a mountain, a chilling aura spreading through the space. The sight sent a shiver down the lion's spine, its eyes flickering with astonishment. It muttered in disbelief, realizing that Leon had surpassed even his ancestors in potential. Lost in thought, the lion seemed to come to a realization. It adjusted its stance, bringing a claw to its mouth as if clearing its throat before speaking again. The lion introduced itself as Marba, one of the 72 demons of hell, who had chosen to turn his back on his demon kin and walk alongside humanity. Marba revealed that he had been a longtime companion of Wellen von Marba, the original source of necromancy, the power that had become the unique legacy of the Marba bloodline. Leon listened without surprise as the lion introduced itself, as if he had long anticipated the revelation. He calmly responded, stating that he knew of Marba from the family's mythology. It was Marba who had taught his ancestor the forbidden arts of necromancy. The lion confirmed the truth of this, admitting that it had once been a terrifying demon before being bound to the tome of the dead. Leon's gaze grew colder as he stared directly at Marba. His voice carried a sharp edge as he asked why the lion had abandoned the family in their final moment of need. His eyes glowed slightly, and even his usually emotionless face betrayed a flicker of anger as he spoke. But Marba, upon hearing this, nearly shrugged and let out a chuckle of amusement. He questioned Leon's claim of abandonment, asking what proof there was to support such an accusation. Leon's expression darkened slightly as memory surfaced. Slowly, he recounted that since the time of their ancestor, Wellen von Marba, the family had been unable to produce a necromancer of his caliber. This, Leon argued, was proof that Marba had turned his back on them. Marba listened intently, giving no response. Without hesitation, he declared that the reason Leon's family had been unable to produce a true necromancer was because they were too weak to be worthy vessels. That weakness, he explained, was why none of them had been able to inherit even a fraction of Wellen von Marba's power, a clear sign of the decline of their bloodline. Leon absorbed these words, his mind processing the implications. After a moment, he realized Marba had no reason to lie. Accepting the truth, he nodded and said he would believe what was being said. Marba raised an eyebrow in amusement. He commented that Leon seemed quick to accept reality. Leon responded indifferently, stating that in war, the weak must always suffer defeat. It was an undeniable law of the universe. Marba studied him for a moment before asking if that was the reason Leon had accepted his father's death so easily. Leon remained expressionless, his voice devoid of emotion as he replied coldly, stating that his father's death had been nothing special, except for one thing. The moment he completely turned his back on their family. Leon paused for a brief moment, locking eyes with Marba. He then made a proposal. He had a request to ask of the demon. Marba's expression shifted slightly, and his voice carried a mocking tone as he responded. He questioned Leon's idea of a request, pointing out that a request implied goodwill, and in such an arrangement, the one making the request was always at a disadvantage. In dealings with a demon, Marba explained, it was more akin to a contract, a transaction. Without hesitation, Leon responded decisively. He asked if Marba could grant him the power of necromancy in exchange for a contract. Marba turned his head slightly, his expression radiating arrogance. He scoffed, questioning what right a brat like Leon had to ask such a thing. He then asked if Leon truly believed his abilities were worthy of such power. Leon answered without missing a beat, his conviction unwavering. He stated that if he were incompetent, he wouldn't even be capable of standing before Marba and having this conversation in the first place. Legends, he pointed out, claimed that speaking to a demon would drain the life from an ordinary person, subject them to hallucinations, and leave them to perish in agony. Considering he was still standing there, Leon reasoned, it meant he must have at least some potential. As Leon spoke, he carefully observed Marbaz's expression, analyzing every reaction. Before long, even Marba himself was forced to acknowledge the boy's potential. The demon began to recognize the considerable power Leon harbored. After a moment of thought, Marba spoke again, reminding Leon that every request made to a demon came at a price. However, before Marba could finish his sentence, Leon cut him off without hesitation. He already understood that everything was a contract, and he wasn't foolish enough to think he couldn't repay Marba more than what he asked for. As he spoke, Leon pointed to himself with unwavering confidence. His sheer self-assurance caught Marba off guard, causing the demon to freeze for a moment. Then, suddenly, Marba burst into laughter, a booming, thunderous laugh that echoed across the space. He declared that, in that case, they would form a contract. Leon, however, was not so naive as to enter into a contract without understanding the terms. He asked directly what Marba wanted in exchange. Marbaz's face twisted, contorting into the true visage of a demon. With a voice dripping with hunger and desire, he declared his price. He wanted everything, every single aspect of Leon's existence. In response, Leon's lips curled into a devilish grin that matched the demon's own. He expressed relief at hearing Marbaz's price, stating that he would gladly sacrifice every part of his insignificant existence. The scene shifted to the conference table. The members of the Marba family remained in the family conference room, unaware of the intense dealings taking place. Growing increasingly frustrated by the sudden departure of the family head, an elderly man with white hair paused a few times before speaking, his voice calm yet deliberate. He addressed the others, acknowledging the current situation. The family head, Lord Leon von Marba, had unable to exercise his authority to make a crucial decision that would affect the entire family. As the uncle and closest kin to the current head, the elderly man had decided to assume control over all matters concerning the family for the foreseeable future. He then allowed the others to voice their opinions about his appointment as the family steward. His face remained expressionless as he spoke, which contrasted sharply with the murmurs that spread through the room the moment he finished. A man with slicked-back brown hair raised his hand and spoke up, suggesting that they had no grounds to object. He pointed out that Leon was still just a child, barely of age, and could not be trusted with the fate of the family. He believed that Lord Kirchhoff was the only one suited to take control of their affairs moving forward. In response, an older man with a thick brown beard voiced his opposition. He reminded them that Lord Leon was the sole direct heir of the previous head and that never before in their history had there been a violation of the direct lineage succession in appointing a family head. However, before he could finish his sentence, the slick-haired man's eyes flared with fury. His bloodshot gaze locked onto the speaker, veins bulging on his forehead as he ground his teeth. His next words were spat out with venom. He argued that precedent mattered little when their entire bloodline was on the verge of being wiped out. The Sylvester family's army was marching toward them, and survival was the priority. He accused the bearded man of being more concerned with inheritance rights than the family's survival, suggesting he was trying to curry favor with the naive young head. His words dripped with treachery, hinting at someone ready to betray the family to ensure his own survival. Hearing this, the bearded man could no longer contain his anger. He slammed his fist on the table, shot to his feet, and roared. He reminded them that every position within the family had been granted through the late head's benevolence, and their duty was to fight for the family, not bicker like fools. His words were filled with righteous fury, but deep down, he knew the truth. Leon had risen to his position too suddenly. He was too young and inexperienced to command true respect. Still, the bearded man remained steadfast in his resolve to support Leon, even though the young head had yet to establish a power base. He vowed not to let Lord Kirchhoff steal the rightful inheritance. Meanwhile, Kirchhoff, the old man with silver hair, calmly rose from his seat. He extended a hand toward the grand chair of the family head, running his fingers along its frame as if savoring the power it represented. Then, with a condescending smirk, he spoke of Leon's royal blood, implying that it was insufficient for leadership. The bearded man immediately cut him off, demanding to know what he was truly trying to say. Kirchhoff's cold, piercing gaze locked onto the bearded man, as he issued a warning. He suggested that despite the man's loyalty, he lacked the insight to see beyond the surface. With a knowing smile, he continued, implying that he had gathered them all not for their input, but for something else entirely. As he spoke, Kirchhoff tightened his grip on the bearded man's shoulder, sending a faint but sinister pulse of mana through his palm. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was enough to make sweat form on the bearded man's forehead. The shift in the room's atmosphere was palpable. Realizing the gravity of the situation, the bearded man clenched his fists and glared at Kirchhoff. Fury boiled within him, but Kirchhoff smirked coldly, not admitting to any schemes but using the bearded man's family as leverage. He warned the man to watch his words carefully, for the sake of his family, and reminded him that they were all gathered for one singular purpose: to make the least disastrous decision for the family's survival. Kirchhoff insisted that there was no need for the bearded man to stand in the way of their survival, and all he asked was that they act with wisdom. With that, he extinguished the mana in his palm. Left with no choice, the bearded man, having had his family threatened, swallowed his rage and accepted the situation. He silently admitted to himself that he had been in Kirchhoff's grasp all along. He bowed his head in defeat, apologizing for his failure to protect the family's legacy. After observing Leon for a while, Marba finally gave his assessment. Everything seemed fine, except for one thing. Due to the shift in the contract's purpose, Leon's true range of power had been significantly diminished. As Marba spoke, he reflected on the situation, thinking of Leon as soft and naive, much like his father. Runet possessed far more mana than Leon did now. Unaware of Marba's internal thoughts, Leon suddenly recalled something. He realized that any demon who forms a contract with a human must absorb mana from their contractor to sustain themselves. He then asked what should be done about it. Marba responded indifferently, stating that there was only one thing Leon could do. However, for the time being, they needed to conserve his mana. With a snap of his fingers, Marba's massive form was engulfed in a swirling vortex of red and black energy. The crimson-lit space around them seemed to collapse inward, drawn into the abyss. When everything settled, Marba had transformed into a much smaller, miniature version of himself. His once fearsome presence had been replaced by a tiny, adorable figure. The little lion stuck out its tongue and licked its paw nonchalantly. In this form, Marba remarked that he was much easier to maintain. Leon, tilting his head slightly, admitted that it made sense. He then teasingly remarked that Marba was cute enough to be considered a pet. Before Leon could finish his sentence, he fell silent as a chilling growl locked onto him. Beside him, Marba's fur bristled with fury as it growled in warning. Leon could feel the threatening aura, and Marba told him not to say he was cute again, warning that he would leave bite and claw marks all over his face if he did. Not wanting any scars to mar his handsome face, Leon simply shrugged and conceded, agreeing not to comment further. Though Marba still seemed slightly annoyed, it quickly moved on to issuing its first command. Marba told Leon that now that they had reached an understanding, they needed to move. Intrigued, Leon asked where they were going. A sly grin spread across Marba's face as he turned back to Leon. He asked if Leon wished to gain the power to rival his ancestor, and suggested that if Leon wanted to climb to the same heights as him, what better way than to follow in his footsteps? Leon stroked his chin thoughtfully. It made sense to him, and he decided it was settled. Marba then declared that they were heading to his ancestor's hidden temple. The dangers of this journey, he warned, could very well claim Leon's life. He asked if Leon would still choose to walk this path with him. Marba's grin widened, and Leon, momentarily stunned, felt a metaphorical question mark pop up over his head. He wondered why Marba kept testing his resolve. Marba immediately saw through Leon's reaction, noticing that the boy had no hesitation. The lion chuckled and began walking ahead, challenging Leon to follow if he thought he could keep up. Time passed in the blink of an eye, and under Marba's lead, Leon arrived in an unfamiliar forest. Taking in the eerie scenery, Leon muttered to himself that this must be the enchanted forest of House Marba. Marba, walking ahead, nodded and explained that the forest was an inscrutable labyrinth to anyone who did not belong to Leon's bloodline. Deep in thought, Leon then posed a question. He recalled that his father had once said that only the true heir of their lineage could step foot into the hidden temple. What puzzled him was why this place, which bestowed the power of a necromancer to their ancestors, seemed to have a flaw. Before Leon could finish his thought, Marba, anticipating the question, answered immediately. He explained that not everyone could successfully overcome the trials. The flaw was that only those who possessed the purest shade of black, the element of the abyss, could complete the trial and reach the temple. So far, no one had ever met the first condition necessary to pass through the fog. Leon responded calmly, his eyes fixated on the thick mist of deep violet and black swirling before him. He understood now, though curiosity sparked within him. Before he could ponder further, Marba raised a small paw with a simple gesture. The dense fog immediately dispersed. Turning back, Marba urged that there was no time to waste and suggested they begin the trial immediately. Not wanting to waste any more time, Leon and Marba quickly stepped into the temple. As they walked, Marba issued a warning. Leon could proceed, but he must tread carefully. From that point on, Marba would offer no assistance. Leon did not complain. In fact, a glimmer of excitement crossed his face. This would be a true test of his courage. Behind him, Marba added one piece of advice. Leon should always follow the guidance of the Necromancer grimoire, as it would lead him to his reward, the power of a necromancer. After this, Marba grinned mischievously. Under the grimoire's guidance, Leon ventured down a silent corridor. As he walked in the eerie stillness, strange noises suddenly caught his attention. Unable to suppress his curiosity, Leon moved closer to the source of the sounds and stumbled upon an unusual sight. The weak, pitiful cries were coming from a group of goblins. Leon swept his gaze around the dimly lit chamber, quickly realizing that the creatures had captured a beautiful young woman. The goblins stood hunched and alert, their glowing red eyes locked onto the young man. Drool dripped from their fanged mouths, making them appear like a pack of rabid beasts eyeing their next meal. At that moment, the Necromancer grimoire suddenly floated back into Leon's hands, its pages flipping on their own. A passage on the open page began to glow with an eerie, mysterious light. The grimoire's message was clear. To fully harness the divine potential of the sacred Necromancer's grimoire, I shall disregard the standard rules of guidance. Your first step toward mastering necromancy, reviving the dead. Leon skimmed through the text, his sharp eyes narrowing in confusion. The book demanded that he begin by taking the life of a living being. After issuing this command, the grimoire snapped shut and hovered in midair. Leon remained silent for a moment before drawing his short blade slowly, his gaze icy as he surveyed the scene before him. His eyes first landed on the terrified girl, her face streaked with fresh tears, trembling in fear. Then, he turned his attention to the goblins, who were now watching him warily. The creatures instinctively spread out, encircling Leon in a loose but threatening formation. Without a command, a large goblin suddenly lunged at Leon, propelling itself toward him with a burst of strength. With no hesitation and no wasted movement, it swung its massive, razor-sharp claws straight at Leon's throat. But Leon was no amateur. With a slight tilt of his body, he smoothly sidestepped the lethal strike. At the same time, his right hand tightened around a short sword. In one swift, calculated motion, he slashed the blade through the goblin's throat. A fountain of blood sprayed into the air as the creature collapsed lifelessly onto the ground. Leon spared only a brief glance at the fallen goblin before shifting his gaze toward the others. The remaining goblins flinched, their bodies stiffening. Instinctively, they took a step back, weariness filling their glowing eyes. Leon exhaled, his voice a whisper, cold and ominous like death itself. One down, told the other to come at him. The scene shifted to a distant moment in time. Leon and his father, Rune von Marba, stood silently before an ancient tomb. The cold wind howled, carrying the somber breath of time itself. Then, Rune turned to his son, locking eyes with him as he spoke slowly and deliberately. He asked Leon what he thought the Marba family valued the most. The answer, Rune explained, was simple. They revered death, for they were a family of necromancers, masters of the dead. Death had to be respected above all else. Leon hesitated, his young mind struggling to grasp the full meaning of his father's words. He raised a hand to his lips, deep in thought, before voicing his confusion. He asked how they could revere death when necromancers, whether they wanted to or not, had to take lives. If gaining power as a dark sorcerer demanded sacrifice, suggesting they were the same as necromancy. Rune was momentarily taken aback by his son's response. He turned fully to face Leon, his gaze heavy with thought before he answered. Yes, they were dark sorcerers feared across the continent, but that did not mean they had to become heartless villains. Rune paused, inhaling deeply before placing a firm, yet gentle hand on his son's shoulder. His voice softened, though his words carried an undeniable weight. He told Leon that he must promise something. No matter who he faced on the battlefield one day, as long as he held the power to take life in his hands, he must grant them a death as merciful as possible. A thought suddenly surfaced in young Leon's mind. Weathers want him to uphold this vow even for his enemies. Back in the present, the battle raged on. Leon faced off against the remaining goblins. His father's words still echoed in his mind. After witnessing the swift demise of their comrade, the goblins had grown wary. Their grips tightened around their weapons, their red eyes glowing with newfound caution. They spread out, moving methodically to encircle Leon, trapping him in the center. But there was no fear in Leon's expression. On the contrary, the deeper he found himself in danger, the colder and sharper his mind became. He analyzed the situation with chilling focus. He realized he needed to strike directly at the cervical spine with absolute precision. It was the quickest way to end them without unnecessary suffering. Thinking through his next move, he prepared for what was to come. Leon tightened his grip on his short sword, his eyes scanning the surroundings with heightened vigilance. From the sidelines, Marbal watched the scene unfold, bringing a paw to his mouth as he chuckled with amusement. It seemed this child had never trained in swordsmanship before, or if he had, it was barely worth mentioning. And yet, he had managed to pierce through the cervical spine with absolute precision. Marbal wondered whether that was just dumb luck or some kind of hidden talent. It wouldn't be long before he got his answer. With that thought, Marbal sharpened his focus, ensuring he wouldn't miss a single moment. Back in Leon's perspective, he reminded himself that dropping his guard just because he had taken down one goblin would be beyond foolish. The kill had been more luck than skill. Goblins were naturally cunning and deceptive, and the darkness made it harder to gauge their exact height. On top of that, his vision could blur at any moment. He remembered the moment he struck down the first goblin, how the nearby torch flickered out. It was best to get used to the darkness while he still could. Instead of slashing wildly, Leon knew he needed to focus on precise thrusts to end lives as efficiently as possible. With the second fatal strike, Leon moved with swift, decisive motion. In the blink of an eye, he slipped behind a goblin wearing an iron helmet. His blade gleamed in the dim light as it drove straight toward its exposed neck. The strike landed with deadly precision, the tip of his sword puncturing cleanly through the vertebrae. But at that exact moment, another goblin lunged at Leon from the side. Its charge was relentless, full of wild aggression. Leon reacted instantly, leaping backward and keeping his distance, dodging the attack by mere inches. The weapons of the two goblins clashed with a deafening clang, sending sparks flying through the darkness. Leon saw his opportunity. Before they could recover, he spun and, with one fluid motion, sliced cleanly through the throat of the nearest goblin. A fresh spray of crimson filled the air as the creature crumpled lifelessly to the ground, following its brethren into the afterlife. The moment the goblin collapsed, the torch in the room flickered out. The darkness, already thick, grew even deeper. Leon had been fighting at an intense pace, and fatigue was beginning to set in. He wiped the sweat from his brow and took a deep breath, thinking to himself, his eyes are adjusting to the dark, and he should be able to see well enough now. But the real problem is, after all that combat, his dagger is nearly ruined. He glanced down at the weapon in his hand. The once sharp blade was now chipped and cracked. He wondered how many more strikes can it endure before it shatters completely. Before Leon could consider his options, a sharp, high-pitched screech tore through the air. His instincts flared. He spun around and immediately spotted a purple-haired goblin rushing toward him. Its blade was already raised high, poised for a lethal strike. Leon clenched his teeth. Too fast. With zero hesitation, he threw his weapon. The dagger spun through the air, barely grazing the goblin's face, leaving a small scratch on its cheek. The creature flinched momentarily, stunned by the unexpected move. Marba, watching from the sidelines, gasped in shock. He exclaimed that Leon had threw away his weapon. His eyes widened in disbelief, but he quickly resumed observing the counterattack. The goblin recovered fast. It snarled, tightening its grip on its weapon, then swung down with full force. However, Leon had already dodged, twisting his body and narrowly slipping out of range. In that brief moment, his eyes locked onto a fallen sword on the ground, the weapon of one of the goblins he had previously slain. Leon lunged, his fingers wrapping around the hilt. He spun around, only to see the goblin already closing in. But Leon was faster. With a powerful push from his right leg, he thrust his sword forward. The blade pierced clean through the goblin's chest, blood spraying across the floor. Leon didn't stop there. Twisting the hilt, he ripped the sword upward, tearing through flesh and bone. The goblin let out a final, strangled gasp before collapsing lifelessly onto the ground. After the battle, with the goblins lying dead around him, Leon turned his attention to the last matter at hand, the captive girl. His footsteps echoed through the now eerily silent room as he slowly approached her. The girl, having just witnessed the slaughter of her captors, seemed to relax slightly, her terrified eyes softening with relief. Leon reached out his fingers, deftly untying the rope that had gagged her. Tears streamed down her delicate face as she gasped in relief, her voice trembling with gratitude. She thanked him, saying that she owed her life to him. But before she could finish her sentence, Leon drove his sword straight through her chest. His face remained cold and emotionless, sending a shiver down the spine of anyone who might have witnessed the scene. Blood spilled onto the cold ground as Leon calmly withdrew his sword. The girl's wide, disbelieving eyes locked onto him, her lips trembling as if trying to form words. Leon stood above her, his expression indifferent. His voice, as cold and merciless as death itself, broke the silence. He recalled a piece of wisdom his father had once shared. His father had spoken of creatures capable of imitating human form, ones encountered during his journeys across the continent. As Leon spoke, he swung his sword again. The blade tore through the air, and this time the girl screamed. However, it was not her cry of pain that caught Leon's attention. It was her body. The illusion began to crack. Her once soft features twisted into something grotesque. Her eyes glowed with a feral hunger, her fangs elongated, and her form morphed into something inhuman. A terrifying transformation revealed her true, monstrous nature. Leon smirked. As expected, his sword dripped with blood as he continued speaking, his voice eerily calm. His father had taught him one final lesson. Never forget those who deceive and prey upon the trust of others. Such individuals did not deserve a peaceful death. They must taste fear and despair, just as their victims once had. To emphasize the point, Leon leaned in, his lips curling into a sadistic smile. He spoke again, laced with malice, offering a lesson in pain. The girl's final moments came in a blood-curdling scream that pierced the darkness, followed by another, then another, until the last torch in the room flickered out. A chilling silence followed, signaling the end of the impostor's miserable existence. The retribution Leon von Marba deemed fitting. The scene shifted to a lavish tavern, grand and extravagant, bathed in a golden glow. The warm flicker of lanterns reflected off polished wood, casting an intimate, indulgent atmosphere. On the grand stage, beautiful women in sultry attire swayed to the rhythm of seductive melodies. Amidst it all, seated in the most luxurious corner of the room, Kirchel, the cunning old man, reveled in his newfound glory. He declared that his time had come. Soon, the cursed family would fall entirely into his hands. Hearing this, the woman in red giggled seductively, leaning closer to his ear. Her voice, sweet as honey, purred about how only a refined gentleman like him could take over, instead of serving some milk-drinking little boy. At her words, the woman in blue covered her mouth, letting out a delicate chuckle before adding that Lord Kirchhoff had indeed managed to manipulate the Sylvesters to achieve his ambitions, aligning with the enemy to rise to power. Only a real man would make such a bold move. The woman in red leaned even closer, almost pressing against Kirchhoff, flattering and seducing him at the same time. With alcohol and victory clouding his mind, the old man laughed heartily, lifting his wine glass in celebration. He grinned and commented on how the women knew how to flatter him. Yet, he acknowledged that they would still have to bow their heads to the Sylvester dogs for a while longer. He took a long sip from his glass before speaking again, his tone dripping with smug satisfaction. Even so, it was far better than letting that brat drag the entire family to ruin. In the end, it was only logical that he should take control. After all, who could deny that he had won the game perfectly? The mere thought of seizing full control over the Marbach family filled Kirchhoff with such euphoria that he could not stop grinning. Across the table, a man with slicked-back brown hair, currently occupied with a stunning woman on his side, observed Kirchhoff's unrestrained amusement. The man casually asked what Lord Kirchhoff planned to do about that kid. The household staff was still fiercely loyal to his father, meaning the boy might be more troublesome than expected. Kirchhoff scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer as he waved dismissively. He saw no reason to overcomplicate things when it came to that brat. His death would be conveniently explained away soon enough. The dead didn't talk, and his father's son wouldn't be an exception. A deranged glint flickered in Kirchhoff's eyes as he reached for the wine bottle and poured a generous amount into the glass of the slick-haired man across from him. The brown-haired man smirked slightly, raising his glass in mock reverence. Lord Kirchhoff's brilliance was acknowledged, and a toast was made to their rightful next patriarch. Hearing this, Kirchhoff laughed heartily, clinking his glass with force before tilting his head back and chugging the remainder of his bottle. Roaring laughter and merriment echoed through the lavish tavern, a celebration of what they all believed to be a foregone conclusion, the complete takeover of the Marbach family. In the neighboring estate, inside an opulent, dimly lit room, Alan, the cunning patriarch of the Sylvester family, sat before his men. His sharp, calculating gaze flickered toward the black-haired subordinate standing beside him. His tone was low, deliberate, and heavy with expectation as he asked about the plan to subjugate the Marbach family. The dark-haired man gave a firm nod, confirming that everything was proceeding smoothly. The only thing left was an official sanction from the royal family, and then everything would be set in stone. Alan smirked, his lips curling into a cruel, mocking smile as he scoffed. He could not understand how anyone could be so blind as to believe he would delay a second war when the first one had barely ended. As he spoke, Alan casually flicked a piece on the chessboard before him, toppling it over. His subordinate eagerly lavished praise upon him, claiming nothing would be possible without Alan's unparalleled strategic foresight. However, Alan paid no heed to the empty flattery. His gaze shifted to a sealed letter resting beside him, next to a portrait of Kirchhoff. The fate of the Marbach family was no longer in their hands, and Alan scoffed once more, his voice dripping with mockery. He found the situation amusing. The Marbach family, reduced to ruins by a traitor like Kirchhoff. He couldn't help but feel excited as he prepared to seize control. He signaled to his subordinates, instructing them to speed up the preparations. His men responded in unison, bowing their heads. Alan smirked, a wicked gleam in his eyes. First, the father, then the son. He could hardly wait to hear the sound of their cries in despair. Meanwhile, after Leon had finished off the imposter creature, the torches inside the chamber suddenly extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. Not a single glimmer of light remained. Forced to navigate blindly, Leon ran his fingers along the hilt of his sword, cautiously feeling his way forward. He muttered under his breath, remarking that it was pitch black now and that this must be it. His voice barely broke the eerie silence. Then, without warning, all the torches reignited at once, but this time, the flames no longer carried an eerie green hue. Instead, they burned with a warm, golden glow. Calm, natural light spread throughout the chamber, illuminating every inch of the space. Leon exhaled a quiet breath of relief. Though his expression had remained cold and composed during the battle, it would be a lie to say he hadn't felt the slightest bit uneasy. Before Leon could gather his thoughts, a blur of movement shot toward him. The tiny lion, Marba, crashed straight into his face, overflowing with excitement. The creature exclaimed that it had never seen a contract holder as insane as Leon, and the impact caused Leon to lose his footing, tumbling straight into a pool of blood on the floor. Yet, Marba showed no remorse. The little creature was so thrilled that steam practically puffed out from his nostrils. Marba declared that Leon now had enough guts to survive in a land crawling with orcs, as long as he could keep his cool. As he spoke, Marba lifted his tiny paws and mischievously rubbed Leon's face. Though Leon frowned in irritation, clearly not enjoying the attention, he did not resist. After a moment, he pushed himself upright, gently placing the small lion-like creature on the ground before calmly stating that he would actually like to encounter the orcs at some point. He had heard that they despised humans more than any other race. Before Leon could continue, Marba swiftly interrupted. What he wanted to know was how Leon had figured out that the last monster was an ally of the goblins. Leon paused for a moment, deep in thought, then replied in a steady voice. It had been simple, he explained. When all the torches went out, but one remained lit, something had been clearly off. Leon had noticed that the torches burned a different color than the ones he had seen before. They were blue. He realized they weren't just torches. They were the lingering shadows of the dead. And sure enough, every time he killed one of the goblins, a torch would go out one by one. Yet, after Leon had eliminated all the goblins, one torch remained burning. It was then that he knew for certain that there was still one more monster hiding among them, and he would not be able to move forward until it was completely destroyed. Leon's voice remained calm and detached, as if the entire situation had been nothing more than a simple strategic game. His chilling nonchalance sent a shiver down Marba's spine. This boy was terrifyingly cold-blooded. Who would have thought that a mere 14-year-old could process all of that, especially in a life-or-death situation? Most people would barely have the capacity to understand their predicament, let alone act immediately. Yet, Leon did it effortlessly. Not only that, he single-handedly wiped out every last enemy using nothing but his own judgment. Perhaps his potential went beyond possessing an enormous mana reserve. Maybe there was something truly extraordinary hidden within him. This was becoming interesting. Amused by his own thoughts, Marba let out a small, mischievous chuckle before shifting his gaze to the floating tome of necromancy. It turned open to a specific page and floated directly in front of Leon. Inside the text, the instructions were clear. First, take the life of a living being. Second, awaken those who have fallen. As Leon's eyes scanned the words, his eyebrows furrowed slightly. The undead, he murmured under his breath, and then his gaze shifted toward the lifeless goblin corpses scattered across the floor. A moment of silence passed before Leon's lips curled into a cold, unsettling smile, one that could make anyone shiver to their core. Beside him, the little lion, Marba, spoke up with clear instructions. Leon was to look at the goblins he had slain and infuse his mana into his eyes to enhance his vision. By doing so, he would see that each of their bodies had a thread leading to an unknown place. In the language of necromancy, this thread was called the death thread. Leon focused on the bodies, and through his enhanced vision, he saw the thin purple threads, almost like strands, connecting the goblin corpses scattered across the ground. He mumbled to himself as he looked at the book in his hands. This thread transcended the boundary of death, linking souls from this world to the next. Marba nodded in agreement, then approached one of the threads. Extending his tiny hand, he flicked it lightly, causing it to vibrate continuously. Marba explained that a necromancer separates wandering souls from their bodies to resurrect them, breathing new life into the bodies by merging the souls with the necromancer's own mana. These resurrected creatures were called Undead. At that moment, Leon infused his mana into the goblins' bodies, and they began to rise from the ground, stiff and awkward. On their foreheads, a purple symbol resembling a sword appeared. Marba nodded in satisfaction and demonstrated further. He flicked his tiny hand again, sending one of the goblins charging toward Leon, seemingly in a crazed frenzy. The sword in his hand was aimed directly at Leon's face, but Leon's cold, impassive expression never wavered. The sword stopped just short of his face. Marba's voice rang out again. explaining that this process was called marking. While there were other ways to create undead minions, this method was the most effective for monsters. He promised to show Leon the other methods later. Returning to Leon, who felt that it was enough for the day, Marba calmly instructed him to try it himself. But Leon didn't rush into action. Instead, he asked a question. Before proceeding, he wanted to ask something that had been bothering him for a while. His predecessor had once said that it was harder to turn a human into an undead than a monster. Leon calmly asked Marba if he thought he had reached the ability to turn a human into an undead. Marba scoffed at the question, remarking that Leon spoke as though he needed it. Leon nodded in acknowledgement. Upon hearing this, Marba's face lit up with excitement. He immediately guessed that someone was about to be in trouble and eagerly asked who this unfortunate soul was. Leon's voice turned cold as he replied, "Kirchel von Marba, Leon's one and only uncle." Saying this, Leon's face held an odd warmth to it. The scene shifted to a luxurious tavern. At that moment, Kirchel, blissfully unaware of the impending trouble, was enjoying the company of a few attractive women. He gently set his wine glass down on the table, and his mocking voice echoed through the room. He spoke of the late head of the family, calling him an idiot. Since his death, Kirchel had been living a smooth life, seizing every opportunity. He laughed and remarked that it had been the life of an opportunist. The man with brown, slicked-back hair quickly added that Kirchel was right. Now, they just needed to deal with his only heir, and they would certainly feel less burdened. On the opposite side, Kirchel waved his hand dismissively, unconcerned, and spoke lightly about killing a brat, stating that it wasn't difficult. He then raised his glass to celebrate, his face dazed as if intoxicated. However, the enjoyment did not last long. Strange noises rang out, startling the group. The chandelier's wire snapped, and it crashed onto the table, sending the group into a panic. The lights in the tavern went out completely, and a series of suspicious events continued, snapping Kirchel out of his stupor. He muttered in disbelief, wondering what was going on. The girl in the blue dress beside Kirchel nervously reminded him that the palace was protected by magical artifacts, and a normal gust of wind couldn't shake the building. Her reminder made Kirchel pause for a moment, his brow furrowing. Then, as if sensing something, he raised his hand to silence her, and turned his gaze forward, loudly declaring that there wasn't a single soul left in the Marba territory bold enough to oppose him. In response, Leon's voice rang out from behind. The familiar voice startled Kirchel. Slowly, he turned around, and upon seeing Leon's face, any worry seemed to evaporate. A mocking smirk appeared, and he casually remarked on the appearance of the new family head. He waved his hand dismissively, and a group of black-clad assassins appeared behind him. It seemed that despite his relaxed demeanor, the old man still had concerns for his safety and had brought his assassins along. Leon widened his eyes and remarked coldly about how considerate it was for Kirchel to still recognize him. The family head, Leon von Marba. Kirchel chuckled, dismissing the comment, saying that he didn't see any reason for Leon to visit him so late without notice. He then asked if Leon needed something. Leon responded with a sharp question, asking if a lord of a domain needed a reason to meet with his vassal. He added that he shouldn't have to announce his intentions for Kirchel's convenience. Upon hearing this, Kirchel, the man celebrating his victory, could barely tolerate the words. His eyes flared with anger, but he kept his composure. Coldly, he replied that perhaps the other lords who deserved it wouldn't need such pleasantries, but they both knew Leon didn't deserve such respect. He mocked Leon further, suggesting he feared his seat as family head would be taken, since Leon's father was no longer there to protect him. Kirchel turned away, calmly pushing aside a curtain, and nonchalantly declared that only he could protect himself. Leon's calm demeanor seemed to fuel Kirchel's arrogance, prompting him to mock Leon for coming alone, so bold, as if he had countless lives to waste. As Kirchel spoke, several assassins raised their weapons, ready to strike at Leon the moment they were ordered. Despite facing them, Leon's expression remained unchanged. He calmly responded that the bold one was Kirchel, thinking he would come alone. Kirchel showed curiosity at Leon's words, asking what nonsense he was talking about. Before Leon could respond, the building suddenly shook again. Kirchhoff looked down and saw dark blue energy ripples spreading in all directions. It felt strange, like magic from the abyss. A suspicion grew in Kirchhoff's mind, which quickly turned into reality. From the dark energy waves, the bodies of two goblins slowly rose, their red eyes filled with bloodthirst. Kirchhoff cried out in surprise, asking if these were undead. Leon jumped into the room and confirmed they were indeed undead. The confirmation left Kirchhoff stunned, his mouth hanging open as he asked how this was possible, as even his late brother couldn't harness such power. Leon, however, had no intention of explaining. Instead, he firmly stated that it was obvious. The Marboff family had once again become a family of necromancers. Kirchhoff gritted his teeth, unable to accept this outcome, especially after he had almost seized control. Roaring in frustration, he commanded his guards to take down the monsters. The unlucky assassins, unaware of necromancy's true meaning, eagerly shouted to take action. At this, one of the goblins rushed forward without needing an order, swinging its sword and knocking the assassin's weapon aside. The startled assassin shouted to wait, revealing that the goblin could fight back. Before he could react, the goblin's arm swung once more, slicing the assassin in half in an instant. Seeing this, Kirchhoff and the remaining assassins swallowed nervously, no longer daring to advance recklessly. The goblins, wielding the advantage of immortality, continued their relentless assault, their sheer strength overwhelming the assassins one by one. As they fell, the fear on Kirchhoff's face grew clearer with each passing moment. Horror gripped him as he finally shouted, branding them as monsters. Confusion clouded Kirchhoff's mind, thoughts racing as he struggled to comprehend what was happening. Something felt entirely unnatural. This defied logic. Unless his eyes were deceiving him, that boy was using necromancy. But such a notion seemed impossible. The mere thought of Leon wielding such forbidden magic sent a cold sweat trickling down his face, his growing anxiety evident. Refocusing his energy, he concentrated power into his palm, forming a dark energy orb before turning his fury toward Leon. With unrestrained anger, he demanded to know what had been done to desecrate the power of their ancestors in such a way. Leon remained unfazed, his expression as cold as ever. To him, there was nothing strange about the head of the Marbar family possessing the ability to control the undead. Before he could elaborate further, Kirchhoff interrupted with another outburst, dismissing the claim as absurd. Necromancy had been buried in the depths of history, a lost art that not even Leon's father could wield in his lifetime. Expecting anyone to believe that a worthless child had accomplished such a feat was beyond reason. Such nonsense would not be tolerated. Yet Leon merely regarded the older man with indifference. If belief proved so difficult, then proof would be the only solution. A warning followed, though, for such knowledge came a price. With that, Leon extended his hand forward, channeling more magic into the undead goblins. The moment they absorbed his power, their twisted grins widened, eyes glowing with an eerie brilliance, as if a newfound strength had been awakened. In unison, the horde of creatures let out a chilling roar and charged at Kirchhoff, intent on overwhelming him. Kirchhoff, letting out an exasperated grunt, refused to stand idle. Without hesitation, he hurled the dark energy orb forward, sending it hurtling toward the approaching goblins with the speed of a violent gust. The attack struck the leading undead goblin before it could react, and immediately, the dark energy began to corrode its skin as though some vile force were consuming it. A smirk of satisfaction crossed Kirchhoff's face at the sight. Perhaps these monsters were not as indestructible as they appeared, but that momentary confidence proved fleeting. The zombie goblin steadied itself, regaining balance despite half of its face having been corroded, the exposed white skull beneath only adding to its grotesque appearance. Yet, for a creature that felt no pain, the damage meant nothing. The fire in its eyes burned even brighter, rage fueling its every movement. Rather than faltering, it surged forward with greater ferocity, determined to strike down the one who had harmed it. Realizing that his attack had failed, Kirchhoff turned in desperation to his subordinates. A call for aid nearly left his lips, but the words died as his face paled in horror. Every last one of his men, lay motionless, their lifeless bodies scattered around him. A curse escaped his lips as he quickly formed another dark energy orb, launching it in an attempt to stall the advancing horde. But no act of desperation would save him now. Deep down, he knew the truth. His skills barely surpassed those of a rookie, and the lingering effects of alcohol dulled his abilities further. The weight of his situation pressed down on him. Escape was unlikely. With no other recourse, he resorted to threats, invoking his family's legacy as a final shield. A warning rang out. Betrayal carried a heavy price, one Leon would regret dearly. But as Kirchel turned toward Leon, a fatal mistake was made. A zombie goblin seized the opening, gripping its sword tightly before rushing forward like a gust of wind. Without hesitation, the blade plunged deep into Kirchel's right chest. Blood gushed from the wound, soaking his suit. His eyes widened in shock as violent coughs racked his body, crimson spilling from his lips. The dark energy ball he had conjured flickered before dissipating completely. It was in that moment that Kirchel understood. There would be no turning the tide. His final words held no power, but still, he uttered them. A fool's accusation, condemning Leon for daring to turn his back on his own bloodline. He threatened that forgiveness would never come. Leon stepped forward with measured steps. His voice, void of emotion, carried the weight of a lesson long learned. He recalled reading a theory on the history of this continent with his father. In history, there were victors and the vanquished, their fates determined by the unfeeling passage of time. Though indifferent to such matters, he could never fully grasp the entirety of its meaning. But one truth stood clear. Victory alone granted the privilege of forgiveness. His gaze, cold and unwavering, fixed on Kirchel. Once, his uncle had been a victor, a man who had chosen survival, stabbing his own brother in the back. But the times had changed. A furious growl erupted from Kirchel, his rage barely masking his impending fate. Leon, seemingly uninterested in prolonging the conversation, spoke his final words. He addressed Kirchel, calling him uncle before making his intentions clear. Leon declared that he would not bid Kirchel farewell. Instead, he vowed to make him suffer every step of the way, remembering this day as the one when Kirchel was defeated. Leon then stated that, as punishment, he would take away the ambition to see another day Kirchel's life in the name of the head of the Marba family. With those words, Leon gestured to his subordinates behind him. The undead goblins charged forward, tearing Kirchel apart like hungry wolves. The last sounds Kirchel made were cries of agony, gradually weakening until they faded into silence. As the carnage unfolded, the little lion, Marba, watched Leon carry out his revenge. Afterward, it slowly walked over to Kirchel's lifeless body and muttered under its breath that Leon was truly insane, as expected. Marba remarked that even Satan might shed a tear at this scene. It was hard to believe that an amateur in necromancy could wield it so skillfully on the first try. Watching Leon use necromancy, Marba thought he had been mastering it for decades. However, Leon did not respond. Instead, as he looked at his uncle's corpse, a new idea suddenly came to him. He clapped his hands, a murderous expression crossing his face. Even Marba felt uneasy, whispering to itself about whether what was happening was fascinating or terrifying. Time passed quickly, and the scene changed to the Marba family meeting room. As usual, everyone had gathered to discuss the family's matters. However, today, two people were absent, Kirchel and his little sidekick. A man dressed in green spoke up, addressing the remaining members. He asked why Lord Kirchel had summoned them. In response, the blonde-haired man shrugged and replied that he was in the dark, just like everyone else. He added that his petty underling hadn't arrived yet, suggesting they be patient for a little longer. On the other side, a bald man nervously voiced his thoughts, wondering if the Sylvester family planned to break the peace treaty and strike while they were still disoriented. As he spoke, his hands trembled continuously, and his words caused the others to grow anxious. The man in the green attempted to reassure everyone, dismissing the concerns. He said it was hard to believe the Sylvester would be reckless enough to break an agreement between two great families. Besides, restarting a war required official approval from His Majesty. The blonde-haired man seemed to relax slightly, nodding in agreement, but still suggested they remain on standby. The truth would be clear once Lord Kirchhoff took charge of the family. Just as the conversation progressed, the door to the room suddenly swung open. However, it was Leon who entered, not Kirchhoff. This unexpected arrival caused surprise among the gathered members, and they whispered to one another. Some wondered why young Master Leon was here instead of Kirchhoff, assuming that he was challenging Lord Kirchhoff, who was the rightful heir. Leon, after walking to the chair designated for the head of the family, paused, glanced around the room, and then coldly addressed the assembly. He asked if they had expected to meet Uncle Kirchhoff in his stead. He told them, in no uncertain terms, that Kirchhoff wouldn't be attending the meeting. In fact, he couldn't attend. Leon's firm words made the man in green uneasy. Unable to suppress his curiosity, he asked Leon to explain further. Leon, emotionless, simply stated that Kirchhoff was dead. He then sat down in his chair, as if the death of his own uncle meant little. Upon hearing this news, the room fell into stunned silence. The remaining council members looked at each other, their gazes locking on Leon with confusion. Leon, noticing their shock, confirmed again that he had killed Kirchhoff with his own hands. He asked if anyone in the council had objections. The first reaction from the group was stunned silence, but the man with blonde hair quickly clenched his fists, slammed them onto the table, and confronted Leon. He demanded a more thorough explanation instead of brief words. He questioned how Leon could explain the death of the Marba clan elder, especially when they hadn't even finished mourning the passing of the late family head. The man with brown hair also chimed in, agreeing that, while Leon may be the family head, he owed them a clear explanation. Leon paused for a bit, observing the blustering elders in the room. Then, in a calm voice, he responded that Kirchhoff von Marba had been a traitor under their name. Not only had he betrayed Leon's father, but he had also given crucial information to their enemy clan, the Sylvester. Leon spoke with a chilling calm, pointing out that despite the concrete evidence of Kirchhoff's treason, there were still those defending him with sincerity. He questioned how, despite everything, Kirchhoff still seemed to have defenders in the room. As Leon spoke, the faces of everyone in the room turned pale. An invisible unease settled on the man with blonde hair. He realized that the council meeting, which had been called in Kirchhoff's name, was happening without Kirchhoff's presence, meaning he had been assassinated. The thought struck the bald man with horror, and he internally cursed the stupidity of Kirchhoff for allowing a mere brat like Leon to take his life. The realization sank in. If Leon had indeed managed to kill Kirchhoff so easily, it signaled the possibility that Leon possessed incredibly powerful magic. With this troubling thought in mind, the man in brown immediately stood, wiping his hands of any ties to Kirchhoff. He muttered in disbelief, expressing his shock at what Kirchhoff had done. Hearing this, the blond man quickly regained his composure and, with sincerity, swore his innocence, claiming that they could not have possibly known what Kirchhoff was planning. However, Leon remained unperturbed by their obvious deceit. He simply tapped his fingers lightly on the table, maintaining his silence for a moment before speaking again. He acknowledged that what they said might be true, but it didn't absolve them of their failure. They had failed to recognize the traitor in their midst, a crime in itself. From the perspective of the man in brown, it was clear that Leon had skillfully lured them all into a trap. His mind raced, trying to grasp the full implications of the situation. Meanwhile, the bald man, who had been silently observing the conversation, spoke up cautiously. He asked whether they had any proof to support Leon's claims, whether he could be sure Kirchhoff was truly a traitor, whether there was any evidence to prove that Leon hadn't simply murdered an innocent man. At these words, all eyes turned toward Leon, expectant, waiting for his response. Having anticipated this question, Leon addressed them coolly, remarking that they had reacted exactly as a far greater entity had predicted. Turning his gaze to the small, lion-like creature perched on his shoulder, Marba grinned with wicked amusement, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Without further hesitation, Leon reached for the book of necromancy, ready to demonstrate the truth of his words. He calmly declared that if they wanted proof, he would show them the betrayal of Kirchhoff von Marba. As the words left his lips, Leon channeled his mana, and instantly the entire chamber was engulfed in swirling tendrils of dark energy. The suffocating presence of death itself spread throughout the room, filling the air with an ominous, unseen weight that made the council members visibly uneasy. However, Leon paid no mind to their growing fear. He began to chant in a low, almost melodic whisper, carrying the weight of an ancient incantation. As a direct descendant of the Marba bloodline, Leon called forth the wandering spirits of the realm. As the incantation echoed, the swirling mass of dark energy spread across the floor. Undead goblins began to emerge from the depths of the abyss. Their grotesque figures clawed their way up, their soulless eyes burning with an eerie crimson glow. Despite never having seen such sorcery before, the council members instantly recognized the spell that had long been lost within the Marba lineage. They gasped in horror as they realized the spell being used. It was the forbidden necromantic summoning. The blond man stammered in disbelief, unable to grasp the sight before him. But the horror did not stop there. Moments later, another figure materialized in front of them, the lifeless body of Kirchel himself. His corpse stood eerily still, animated by the same dark force that had summoned the goblins. The sight of him drained the color from the man in Brown's face. His body trembled, cold sweat dripping from his forehead as he struggled to process what he was witnessing. He muttered in disbelief, asking whether Leon had somehow mastered the lost magic of their family. Unfazed by the growing fear in the room, Leon observed his resurrected uncle with cold indifference. He then coldly commanded Kirchel von Marba to confess all his sins, to reveal everything he had done, while still possessing the memories of his treacherous actions. The brown-robed man, unable to bear the reality of the situation, shrieked in panic, but before he could say another word, Leon silenced him with a sharp interruption. He had grown tired of the questions. Leon stated flatly that there was nothing shocking about necromancy. It was the very foundation of the Marba bloodline. As if responding to his words, the undead goblins tightened their grip on their weapons, their fiery red eyes locked onto the trembling council members like predators preparing to strike. Their hunger for bloodshed was unmistakable. Realizing Leon's intentions, the blond man's expression twisted in sheer terror. He quickly turned to the others and shouted for them to run for their lives, urging them to save themselves. The bald man snarled through gritted teeth, but before he could flee, it was already too late for him. With a single swift motion, the brown man's head was severed from his shoulders, his lifeless body collapsing onto the blood-soaked floor, spraying crimson across the room. The sickening scent of iron filled the air. The man in the green robe recoiled in horror, stumbling backward as panic overtook him. But before he could regain his composure, another chilling scream pierced the air, someone begging for help, desperate for salvation. The desperate plea belonged to the blond man, who lay sprawled on the floor. His legs had been severed, and his trembling hands clawed at the ground in a futile attempt to escape. A trail of blood smeared behind him as he dragged himself forward, his face contorted in agony. Completely unmoved by the carnage around him, Leon approached the crippled man with unshaken authority. His voice, devoid of emotion, cut through the chaos like a blade. He remarked, almost casually, that he hated to interrupt, but the meeting was far from over. Leon then declared that the man would listen to every word his true lord had to say before the session could be adjourned. The book in Leon's hands emitted a radiant violet glow, its arcane energy extending toward the lifeless body of Kirchel. The corpse trembled violently, convulsing with eerie, guttural screams that echoed through the chamber. Unfazed by the chaos, Leon asked coldly if there was anyone in the room unaware of the grievous crimes Kirchel had committed. Kirchel's reanimated body shuddered before responding in a fragmented, rasping voice. The confession came without hesitation. Every servant of the late head of the family had turned their backs on him until his dying breath. Not a soul here had been ignorant of his betrayal. The confession was damning, a death sentence for the council members. However, Leon remained unsurprised. His expression didn't shift in the slightest. He calmly acknowledged that the matter was settled. On the blood-stained floor, the blond man, realizing the inevitable, desperately turned to Leon, pleading for mercy. Beside him, the man in the green robes fell to his knees, shaking with terror. He begged for a chance to atone for his sins. Even the bald man, who had been the most defiant, now bowed his head, pressing his trembling hands together in desperation. They all begged for a chance to prove their loyalty. But Leon had no intention of granting forgiveness. He stood there, his cold gaze unmoving, as the undead goblins under his command ruthlessly executed every last traitor. The chamber filled with the agonized screams of those who had once held power. Their final cries were drowned out by the sickening sounds of flesh being torn apart. The stench of fresh blood was overwhelming, thick and nauseating, filling the room with a suffocating aura of death. Then, Leon seemed to recall something. Lifting a hand, he effortlessly recalled the Necromancer's grimoire back into his grasp. With an air of finality, he declared that, by the power flowing within him, as the rightful head of this family, he, Leon von Marba, proclaimed before the council that the dark arts of necromancy had once again returned to the house of Marba. Time passed, and soon, all the family elders in the room were lying in pools of blood, their breaths extinguished. Leon scanned the surroundings before speaking, asking where he could find Sir Pullen. A trembling servant cautiously stepped out from behind the curtain and replied that he had heard Pullen had been thrown into the dungeon for inciting rebellion. The servant, still shaking with fear, continued, his anxiety palpable. Leon didn't spare him a glance. He simply commanded the servant to lead the way. The servant, relieved, quickly complied. As Leon was about to push open the door to leave, he seemed to remember something. He turned back and addressed the remaining members of the room. He gave them the option to leave, but reminded them that whatever happened next was unpredictable. He trusted they would make the right choice. His words were laced with a quiet threat, though the implication was clear. Anyone who dared try to escape would become food for the undead in an instant. The scene shifted to Alan's office, where a dark-haired subordinate brought him a letter. A letter arrived for Lord Alan, catching him by surprise. He hadn't expected anyone to send him correspondence at this time. Taking the letter from his subordinate, he quickly read its contents. A crafty smile spread across his face as he shared the information with his subordinate. The royal family, it seemed, had turned their back on the Marba family. Upon hearing this, the dark-haired subordinate wasn't particularly surprised. He remarked that, apart from their ancestors, the Marbase had done nothing to showcase their so-called fame. The resources and manpower they possessed were nothing more than a joke. Lord Alan nodded in agreement, acknowledging that they were weaker than before. He emphasized that the plan must continue. The Marba family would kneel before the upcoming noble war next month. He then asked if his subordinate was capable of handling it. The subordinate clenched his fist and confidently assured Alan that he was more than capable. However, Alan remained focused on the larger picture. He added that they couldn't afford to lose, unless, of course, a powerful high-level necromancer emerged to lead the Marba family after centuries of decline. He mused that maybe they would resurrect Lord Welland von Marba from the dead, but that it didn't matter. Defeat for the Marbase had already been sealed. This battle would be theirs to win, and Alan laughed, showing no sign of worry. The scene shifted to the Marba family prison. Leon, following the servant's guidance, arrived at his Uncle Pullen's cell. Upon seeing Leon, Pullen immediately knelt, begging for forgiveness. He admitted his guilt, acknowledging that he had allowed Kirchhoff's dark ambitions to brew unnoticed, putting Leon in danger. He accepted death for his actions. Leon, watching the man kneeling before him, thought to himself that Pullen was one of the few remaining loyal servants of the Marba family, and the only one to openly oppose his uncle. He knew he had to recruit him. With that thought, Leon bent down and helped Pullen to his feet, telling him to stand up. There was still much to be done, and Leon needed his help. Pullen, with tears in his eyes, questioned what he, a fool, could do to help. Leon didn't answer immediately, but noticed an unpleasant odor on Pullen's body. He suggested that Pullen first take a bath and then meet him in the head's room to discuss the details. Pullen's face lit up with joy as he quickly affirmed his loyalty. He promised to follow Leon to the very end, his eyes watching Leon's figure slowly shrink in the distance. As evening approached, Leon stood quietly by the window, observing the world outside. Meanwhile, the little lion, Marba, jumped onto his shoulder, licking his hand and asking what Leon's next move would be. Leon fell into deep thought, contemplating his options. After some time, Uncle Pullen arrived as instructed. He was taken aback after hearing Leon's intentions. Stepping back in haste, he urgently advised against contacting the Sylvester family while impersonating Kirchhoff. He argued that it would take great power to pull off such a difficult task, especially since Kirchhoff had already betrayed them. Leon, however, had already prepared for this moment. He pulled out his necromancy book to show his uncle something. He asked if this would work, and with that, he used magic to summon a shadowy figure. The figure, humanoid in shape, began to slowly transform. Its outer shell dissolved, revealing the form of the old man Kirchhoff. Even the cold expression on the face was identical to the one Kirchhoff had worn in life. Uncle Pullen stood stunned, his eyes wide with disbelief. He asked what kind of magic this was and how Leon, the family head, could remain so unfazed by it. It was clear to Pullen that Leon had created a necromantic servant out of his own uncle. Pullen had heard rumors, but seeing it firsthand left him in awe of Leon's incredible power. Pullen was moved to tears, realizing the truth of the rumors, that Leon had mastered the powers of a true necromancer. Leon nodded lightly, confirming it. Pullen, with a sigh, commented on the cruelty of fate. In the golden age of the Marba family, the head of the family could achieve anything with the powers of a true necromancer. But now, he wondered if the heavens had been so cruel. After a brief pause, Pullen shared his thoughts. Normally, ordering Kirchhoff in his necromantic form would be enough to deceive the Sylvester family for a time. However, eventually they would figure it out. Necromancy couldn't imitate someone's speech, handwriting, or actions. In response, Leon explained further that this wasn't just any necromancy. It wasn't the necromancy of Kirchhoff von Marba. This was the form of a necromantic twin, a creature capable of imitating someone's appearance, memories, and even their abilities. As Leon spoke, he turned and gestured to the fake Kirchhoff. To Pullen's astonishment, a black flame suddenly erupted from the fake Kirchhoff's hand, mirroring the magic that Kirchhoff himself had used in the past. This moment took them back to the time when Leon had been in the secret temple, having eliminated the fake monster that had been posing as a girl. Afterward, Leon had asked Marba about the strange creature, inquiring if it had a name. Marba had shared what he knew. This was a twin creature, capable of replicating a portion of someone's appearance, memories, and abilities. It was a disgusting being, one that enjoyed impersonating missing adventurers, killing the original, and devouring their companions by using the memories it had copied. As Leon thought about how best to use this creature, Marba chuckled with amusement. He commented on how Leon had inherited his father's traits, well, in having been kind enough to leave his most loyal subordinate to the family's heir, though unaware of what was happening. Leon used his necromancy on the girl's corpse, and immediately her eyes snapped open as she came back to life. The little lion, Marba, warned Leon to be careful, explaining that this creature could only transform into someone the necromancer had encountered. Furthermore, any being with stronger mana than the caster couldn't be recreated or impersonated. After a brief pause, Marba added that while Leon had great talent, he was still young. Even if Leon trapped his uncle's soul, it would decay over time, eventually returning to the void. He promised to find a solution to this problem, but before Marba could finish, Leon interrupted, stating that he would not betray his family. He acknowledged that the day might come when he wasn't innocent, and that many innocent people in the territory would die when the Sylvester family attacked. Leon firmly stated that he would die for them, a response that piqued Marba's curiosity. He wondered what could drive someone like Leon to be so loyal to the family. Marba, now turning his focus back to the pressing matters at hand, instructed Leon to proceed with using the necromancy on a doppelganger. Marba, with certainty, declared that Leon would find it useful for his current situation, although the doppelganger could be a bit hot-headed at times. Leon didn't hesitate, immediately using necromancy on the doppelganger's soul. He commanded the shadow to heed his call and return to the land of the living. The shadow's body slowly began to change, eventually taking the form of a grown man. But before the shadow could wake up fully, Marba jumped forward, slapping the back of its head and scolding it for showing off, saying they had a contract holder to attend to after centuries of slumber. The doppelganger, pointing to itself, tried to explain something, but couldn't say a word. Marba, frustrated, yelled at the doppelganger to at least change its form so they could understand it. The ghost thought for a moment, then put both hands together in front of its chest and performed a hand seal. Gradually, the black smoke around its body dissipated, revealing Leon's form inside. With the transformation complete, the ghost could now speak normally. As it teased Marba, calling him a stupid cat and claiming it was already dead, Leon observed the doppelganger's mimicry abilities. Uncle Pullen, after seeing the doppelganger's impressive skills, nodded in agreement. He concluded that if a necromancer could impersonate Kirchel using the memories the creature had, they could deceive the Sylvester family. He expressed confidence that he would ensure the plan was carried out well. Leon, satisfied with Pullen's response, agreed to the plan. However, Pullen raised a concern. He asked why, with Sylvester already having royal approval to attack the Marba family, Leon had chosen to stay in such a dangerous situation instead of fleeing to improve their chances of survival. Leon's answer came firmly. He declared it was his responsibility to protect the family. Pullen, startled by the intensity in Leon's voice, he affirmed that he would do his best. Then, he asked what made Leon so sure his decision would succeed. Leon, rubbing his chin as he thought, answered that while he didn't yet know the best course of action, he had been contemplating the situation for a while. He confessed that he wasn't sure how to be a good leader, acknowledging that he wasn't meant to be one from the start. The answer, he said, was still unclear. Leon reflected on his choice to stall the enemy until he could answer the question that had been weighing on him. He resolved not to tire himself out, understanding that the enemy intended to strike. As long as he didn't repeat his father's mistakes and protected what they had, he believed he would eventually find the answer to why he fought for this place. That, for now, seemed to be the only course of action. Time passed quickly until evening, and the scene shifted to Leon's bedroom. The doppelganger, arms crossed, commented on the state of the family. It remarked that no one could have predicted how far the family had fallen. It casually spoke, almost as if to a friend, saying Leon had a lot to do. This irked the little lion, Marba, who furiously reminded the doppelganger to address Leon as Lord, not speaking so casually. Confused, Leon questioned why he should bother with titles, since Marba himself didn't seem to care about them. Marba flinched, turning to Leon and asking if he truly didn't care about titles. Slightly surprised, Leon responded that he didn't, but was curious how Marba knew that. Marba hopped off the bed, answering that he just had a feeling. Then, he continued, praising Crow as a capable servant, loyal to their ancestors, and skilled in assassination. After pondering, Leon agreed, finding the doppelganger's ability to transform useful for such tasks. Crow sneered, remarking that he was good at killing, unlike some sick cat. His words earned a glare from Marba, who snapped back, questioning if Crow wanted to be sent back to the abyss. Without hesitation, Marba rushed forward and sank his little fangs into Crow's head. Observing the bickering with little attention, Leon calmly asked Crow if he could handle the Kirchel situation. With a cold tone, Crow responded that it would be a piece of cake. Marba, releasing Crow and mocking him, joked about how easy it was, comparing it to a rabbit. Confused, Crow countered that a tiger would taste better. Leon shrugged, saying nothing, while Marba reminded him not to agree with Crow's idiotic remarks. Just then, a knock on the door interrupted the conversation. Leon asked who was there, and Uncle Pullen rushed into the room, panic evident on his face. He handed Leon a letter from Sylvester, explaining that it contained urgent news. Leon quickly read its contents, which declared that the Sylvester family, led by Count Alan de Sylvester, would declare war on the Marba family unless they surrendered. If the Marbase refused, they would be wiped out within a month, and a new order would be established under the Emperor's approval. Coldly, Marba remarked that the storm had arrived. Leon muttered that they still had a month. Marba, attempting to lighten the mood, teased that Leon was scared, but Leon quickly corrected him, saying that he wasn't afraid, but he wasn't sure he had the patience to wait that long. He conjured a black flame in his hand and burned the letter, his cold expression making Marba slightly irritated. Marba reminded him that the enemy might have hundreds or even thousands of soldiers, and that this was very different from fighting his uncle. Unafraid, Leon flashed a slightly excited smile. He confidently stated that they would be fine, and at this time he wouldn't hold back. All he needed to do was wipe everything clean.